So I grew up in a pretty traditional conservative Black church. And not necessarily conservative in terms of political views, and everyone in the church identified as a conservative. But the congregation that I went to, for the most part, it was an older congregation. People within the congregation did have children who did attend, but as they aged, they would also, not also, as they aged, they would leave the congregation. And so mostly the folks who went to my church were a lot of Gen Xers, boomers on back. Gen Xers and boomers. So when I say conservative Black church, I don't mean conservative in the way they identify politically, although there are people in the church who are conservative. I feel like conservative and Christian kind of go hand in hand. But a lot of the people in my church were older, and so a lot of what they held on to weren't doctrine that was scriptural, but more so things that were cultural and generational, especially seeing how it was a number of people who moved from down south up to the Midwest, up to Chicago. And that was very much reflected in their conversations and the way that they moved. When I think about gender roles within my church, it's what you would probably expect when it comes to a church. Only men were allowed to have the positions of leadership within the congregation. Only men were allowed to do the teaching if they were hitting the road to go to churches in other states to then preach and teach. It was always an all male crew. Women are usually allowed to serve on committees that are spearheaded by men, and in some instances, they're also allowed to read. So, traditionally, what you would expect within the church: men lead, women help and follow. And a lot of the sermons, even when it kind of discussed, even outside of church leadership, a lot of the sermons, when it talked about marriage, often did talk about marriage in a way that I feel like many of us are used to. God is over everything. Man is the head of the household. A woman takes care of the house, leads, caretaking kids, all of that. At one point in time, and I think is very interesting, is that when a woman had her cycle, according to how they interpreted the scripture, a woman was then deemed unclean. So actually, in the church that I left, in the church history, there was a period of time where women were regulated to sit in different seats altogether in the church because they were on their cycle. And even a history of women who would just not go to church at all because they were on their cycle. Now they don't do the whole chair thing anymore. And as far as whether or not women go when they're in their cycle or not, I don't know. For a while, I was one of those people. If I was on my cycle, I wouldn't want to go. But if being completely honest with you, I can't say I wanted to go in the first place. And there's this quote from season one of Project Deconstruction that's my favorite. And it's an episode with JL. And one of the things that he said was, did I have a choice on going to church? No, I didn't have a choice on getting into Christianity. The choice I had was whether or not I was enthusiastic about it. And that just sums it up perfectly, because the choice to go to church wasn't mine. And so if I could use those moments to stay home, I was. I was. And I feel like growing up, I had my quiet rebellion, because I feel like when people talk about what it meant to be woman or wife within the church or within sermons, a lot of it was centered on what does it look like to be of service for someone else? And I wasn't interested in that, right? You go your whole life being a minor, being a child, and you have to exist under the rule of like your father in the household. And then when you get married, you're passed from father to husband, and then now you have to submit to somebody else. And then you have the kids. And I that's not a life that I at all like desired for myself. When I imagined my future, it didn't center a marriage, and it didn't center kids. And even when I would hear women growing up, both in the church and outside of the church, I just heard so many stories from women who wanted to do something different, or wanted to go to school, or wanted another career field, and felt like they never really had that opportunity to. And I just never wanted that to be my story. I'm not gonna hold you. One of the things that did upset me when I was in church, that to this day still upsets me about church folks, and I feel like it shouldn't because it's none of my business, is that I feel like growing up, there were so many women who were content with the way things operated, with the sermons that were discussed, with being this secondary helpmeet role. And I'm not going to hold you, that really infuriated me. Even when it came to my church had a dress code. And a part of that dress code was that women couldn't wear pants. And so it was dresses or it was skirts. You couldn't do skirts, no pants, whatever. And then in addition to that, women always, not always, women had to have their head covered once the actual lesson sermon started. Now, this was different at some of the other churches. We had churches in different states, but all under the same umbrella. And at different churches, women would have to wear headscarves from the second they walked into church. And all of these really did irritate me. Like, now, don't get me wrong, a part of me appreciated going to church and having the aspect to get somewhat dressed up, because on a day to day I wasn't getting dressed up. So if it's a day for me to pop out and look good, I appreciated that. That's where I was trying new hairstyles. That's when I was trying new makeup looks. That was when I was trying new outfits. At least once I got to like high school and college, I was really experimenting. In elementary school, not really. I wasn't yet shopping for myself. I'll pick out things if I'm going out with my family, but in a sense of, oh, I'm going into stores, I'm going into thrift stores, and I'm picking this out. I wasn't doing all of that. And so a part of me appreciated the opportunity to get dressed up, but also a part of me was just very upset that women had to wear the skirts and the dresses. And I remember asking people about the dress code. I was like, well, they do it this way over here, but this way over here, there's nowhere in the Bible that says women have to wear clothes. And even the people in the Bible, they was in there wearing skirts and stuff. So I don't understand this dress code, right? That was one of those things that is generational, that is cultural, but it's not scriptural. And anytime I would ask questions on that, it would always just come down to, well, oh, well, that's the rules. Okay, and y'all are just so content with that. And a lot of them were. And I feel like that was something that was very hard to sit with after I deconstructed, because when I would talk to people about the reasons why I would left, they would be like, yeah, no, that makes sense. And oh, yeah, I agree. And oh, I didn't like that either. Or I don't agree with this and the third. I was like, so why has no one said anything and nobody did anything and nobody leaving? We're just here. But I feel like with a lot of the women who chose to serve, and that's not any shade to people who choose to serve, because I do still think that doing community service is a beautiful thing, they were just okay with that. There wasn't a lot of challenging. I do know the women in my family were and are a bit more outspoken when it comes to things that happen within church. So if it's something that happens that doesn't sit right with them, they'll say something. One of my family members noticed that on certain Facebook posts, if a woman would make a correction to a post that a man would make, her comments would be deleted, and she blasted that. But there wasn't a lot of direct challenging, which also was a part of the reason why I created Project Deconstruction, because let's have these conversations. Let's do the challenging. Let's talk about the things that don't make sense, that everybody knows don't make sense, but yet people choose to stay quiet. So growing up, and I recognize that I was a bit, when I talk about it with my friends, I was the odd one out. But I'm someone who has never really romanticized or had a big goal set for myself to get married and to have kids. That was never something that was on my to do list, on my bucket list. And it wasn't any of those things that I was obsessed with. I feel like there are so many people around me who have dreamed of their wedding day, who know the dress, what type of ring, what type of cut they would like. And those are things that I honestly never gave much thought to until I was in a relationship with someone and they were asking me questions like, what type of ring would I like? Which was the first time I thought about that. And so growing up, growing up, it felt like a quiet rebellion to really prioritize myself in ways that I didn't see women doing, where I was thinking about, what did I want to do with my time? What did I want my life to look like? What did I want my work to look like? And none of that involved kids or even a partner. And so that was my experience growing up. And that's something that carried into college, which I'm very happy that it did, because I had a ball in college. Like that transition of coming into young adulthood, of coming into self, and coming into self on your own terms, for me was a beautiful time. And I feel like since then, I just continued to get even deeper into that. And what does that look like? And really exploring those parts of myself away from a lot of the control, fear, and shame that I feel like exist in churches often. Um, and I appreciate that. What I think is interesting when I reflect on how traditional gender roles are often enforced in church is even when it comes to people who are not religious, even whether that's men or women, even if they're not religious, I find it to be so fascinating when I feel like day to day folks who don't go to church, who aren't really attached to any type of doctrine, still hold on to these traditional gender roles where people have this idea men should do this and women should do this. And here are distinct roles that very much still give indoctrination, even if that person themselves isn't religious. And I think it's so fascinating because if you ask people if they're religious, they'll say no. But if you start to talk more deeply and specifically about what they believed in, it starts to sound real churchy. It starts to sound real churchy, and I just find that to be incredibly fascinating.